So what I want to talk about next is sort of evidence on what we know about the evidence. And this is the annual review paper that the main paper, a lot of what I talk about today it can be found in there. A lot of the references, et cetera. This is going to be, go almost exclusively through that. I want to, so remember we started off with a couple of these kind of empirical predictions. This is a lot of the literature kind of goes through these. There's a, sort of the literature-related income attendance relationships I'll talk a little bit about, and other choices and how they relate to family income. There's a little bit of discussion that will kind of center on both of these, of how the marginal returns to schooling, in particular, vary by as you vary costs. And then I'll talk about sort of some structural models that implicitly are using sort of all of these things are implicitly being used in identification and estimation. And then I'll talk about a few other things that don't really fit in any of these categories. Yep.
When you say that unconstrained borrowers, like how much education they get doesn't depend on wealth, like in order to be unconstrained, do they need to have a certain amount of wealth to begin with?
Yes, it would be wealth above some level. Once you get wealth above that level, they would be unconstrained. Or if you thought constraints didn't bind for anybody, then we shouldn't see any relationship between wealth and attendance. And now that's, again, subject to the caveat that there's not these other motives for going, that people enjoy it or not. So I'll talk very briefly about that. So as I said earlier, if you look in I start off with sort of the simplest stuff that sort of motivated a lot of the literature on borrowing constraints in the first place in the education sector. And as I mentioned, the Carneiro and Heckman work, Cameron and Heckman are kind of the forerunners of this, and show that if you look in the early 1980s, once you condition on, in their data would be sort of family background measures like parental education, and in particular AFQT score. So I don't know if you guys know what those are. These Armed Forces qualifying tests, this battery of tests everybody in LSY took. The military actually uses these to determine whether you get in or not and to assign you somewhat. But they had everybody take it, right? Almost everybody in their sample take it. And look at, and we know from a lot of literature that's strongly related to who goes to college. I'll show you that as well, and also in terms of earnings, all kinds of outcomes. It's sort of the measures that are most relevant are sort of a math and a reading measure for the most part. If you sort of strip out the math and reading from it, there's a fourth component. If you strip that out, things look very similar. But once you control for their family background and these AFQT, these guys are taking it as adolescents, around 16 to 20 years old. In particular, if you focus on the younger guys, family income doesn't really matter much in the NLSY 79 for who goes. So let's see, I got to go to my thing. I'll show you. So that sort of led to this huge shift away from thinking about borrowing constraints, I think, a bit. And I found this very convincing, and I'll show you some other approaches that all find sort of evidence sort of consistent with that story. And here's what I talked about earlier. If you actually compare the NLSY 79 that Carneiro and Heckman and Cameron Heckman used with the NLSY 97 and do kind of this parallel analysis, you find that family income is much more important in the more recent year, for the more recent cohort. So controlling for family background and ability, a youth from a high-income quartile in the NLSY 97 is 16 percentage points more likely to attend college than someone from a low-income quartile, conditional on achievement. So that's pretty big. I mean, Heckman and Carneiro and Heckman are talking around 6 to 8 percentage points, and they say, well, it's kind of rounding error. Not quite, but that's essentially their argument. Is it's not very big. This is sort of basically doubles the effect. If you also were to condition on, say, wealth and family income, which you can do in the NLSY 97 and not in the 79, you basically find someone in the high income and high wealth quartile is 30 percentage points more likely to go to college than someone in the low income and low wealth quartile. So it'd be hard. You wouldn't want to look at that and say, well, you wouldn't dismiss borrowing constraints very quickly looking at those numbers. Now, I don't want to say that's proof of borrowing constraints. But it's consistent with it and consistent with sort of the borrowing constraints may have become more important in recent years. So I'll show you the graph. See if,
I'm wondering where the the most recent results of the AFQT were showing that some, like 25% of our youth aren't even able to qualify for military service. And I'm just wondering how, like this, if it's affected or been affected by this idea of, wealth and relationship with performance. That's a big debate in education overall, like resources, should we throw more money into schools? Is about
I mean, whether AFQT scores have become more correlated with wealth or income,
well, 'cause you're saying,
they have a little bit.
yeah.
Not a whole lot, but they have a bit over this period. I mean, we're essentially going to want to think about holding some guys' ability, compare guys, and we just talk about it in quartiles. You can break it up into deciles if you want. You can control for a whole bunch of other measures of ability, non-cognitive type skills, social skills, everything. Whatever you look at, if you cut the data, whatever you want to throw in there. So one concern is, well, you just haven't control for all the measures of ability, and that's almost certainly true. But you could throw in a bunch of other things that every ASVAB score in there. You could throw in sort of whether they're engaged in crime, all sorts of things. And it doesn't really move the numbers that much. And nothing changes the fact that the effects of family income have basically doubled over this time period. And let me show you a graph, and then I'll come back to you here. So this is give you a sense for, well, let's see. Maybe it will. So this relates to some questions earlier, a little bit about who's going to college and how that's changing over time. This cuts the data by, this is the NLSY 79, and says break it up into AFQT quartiles, and then within that we can look by family income and family income quartiles. So what you see is clearly AFQT and ability is really important for schooling. And you look in this, it's much more important than income. That was sort of the larger point, the basic point of Cameron and Heckman and Carneiro and Heckman, and that still holds in the NLSY 97. You do see that income appears to be a bit important at the higher ends of the ability distribution, not very important at the bottom end. When you kind of average across, it's just not very important. But if you look at the NLSY 97, so if you focus on these two graphs, you'll see these things change completely. These kind of look pretty much the same. But now you see across the board in every ability category, family income is more important for who goes to college. And what you'll notice is these bars here. For the low ability, the bottom half of the ability distribution, low income guys haven't really changed their college going much at all. You've seen the high income guys respond a lot going up, but not the low income, which is a bit interesting given that one of the big changes over the period of the 80s and 90s is the sort of the expansion of community colleges, which one would expect to basically be working on kind of these guys here mostly, maybe some of these guys too, but also focused on lower income individuals. But whatever your interpretation of the data is, those guys haven't, the low ability, lower income guys have not responded much over the last 20, 30 years. Yep. Well, I should.
No, you've actually answered.
Okay.
Following up on what she was asking, like, I guess, like, I would like to see, like, the width of those bars too, like, in the sense, how many low-income families are actually in the bottom quartile of the AFP?
Ability. Yeah. So I don't. It's pretty strong. There's about. Let me think. I want to say. You'll have about 3% of the population in the corner, the off-diagonal corners, high ability, low income, and low ability, high income, and then you'll have more, maybe around 10% kind of along the diagonal more. So it's certainly pretty strongly correlated, but it's far from perfectly correlated, and that's a point Carneiro and Heckman make as well, is that we can actually separate these out a bit. A larger question, and that's the part of the talk I'm going to cut out, is what's driving? Where do these things come from? These aren't necessarily innate. Indeed, they're not innate. There's a whole fight over that. when I was a graduate student about whether AFQT is some sort of innate ability. And it's clearly not. It responds to investments. It responds to schooling. So the larger question is, why is it that the low-income families also producing kids with the lower AFQT scores, and what role are credit markets and everything playing there? I'm going to cut all that out. It's in the slides. There's probably plenty of detail in there, and I'm happy to talk about that after, but I don't have time, I think, to do it today. Yep?
So the low-income didn't respond in terms of college fundings, but then you were saying that you think they were the ones who started wanting more, or it happens in the quartile 3 and quartile 4.
Yeah, I don't, this data has measures of borrowing, but it's pretty, I don't believe any of it. Yeah, I would guess, I don't know for sure. My guess is it would largely be up in these parts of the distribution. But, it could even be these guys down here, even if they're not going more, they're borrowing a lot more because the costs have gone up. But we don't have a good set of information on who's doing all the additional borrowing. At least I haven't looked at that very carefully yet. It's a good question. In this data, I did at one point look at it in this data, and I don't think that this data is particularly good on that dimension. The MPSAS would be better. There you wouldn't have AFQT, but you maybe have SAT scores. You could look by SAT scores and then by family income or something like that. Somebody may have broken that out, but I don't know offhand what the numbers are. Another question? Yep.
Sorry. What was the name of that data set you said?
NPSAS, National Post-Secondary Aid Survey. They do those every couple of years, and it's very detailed on I think they even get the records on people's financial aid, and what schools they went to, et cetera. You can get a bunch of it online. You can have it do a lot of crosstabs for you online. If you want to get the raw data, you have to apply through the NCES, National Center for Education Statistics, Department of Education, basically. That's not trivial to get, I don't think, but actually it's impossible in Canada, it turns out, unfortunately. But if you're in the US and you can give them a reason why you can't do what you want to do with their simple thing they have online, if you want to do something fancier than a very simple regression, you probably can get it.
The other question I wanted to ask is for the guys in the bottom part of quartiles, you have 80% of them opting not to go to college.
Yep.
And so how should we think about the model of dealing with those guys? Should we think about the model of dealing with those guys in terms of they're at the corner and age is 0?
Well, I would think, ideally, I would think about modeling it with, there I would probably want to, I would think you would want to generalize the model to allow for, or restrict the model to have limited set of H's would probably be the easiest. In a paper that we do this stuff, we kind of think of whether you go to college or not, and you can have ability affects the returns to going. That's, I think, probably the easiest way to think about it. And then there's some taste that means otherwise everything's always 0 or 1. Everybody in a group would go or not. You need something unobservable that varies across people.
So then break up our constraints in terms of saying, do you go to school or do you not? That's sort of constraints are operational on the excess margin. And then we also break up boring constraints in terms of saying, how much school did you get? Community college or public college?
How many years do you go? It could be, yeah, exactly. It could be what quality of institution you go with. The model at this stage is, the model is really at this stage, to provide some basic insights as to what kinds of things you would expect. I'm going to talk about some stuff that the model itself doesn't say anything about, but one could generalize it to talk about sort of some other dimensions. I think you want to think more about the model. You could think about it as how many years of school, or whether you go to more expensive, 4-year versus 2-year. I think the model is roughly useful for thinking about that. the one thing the model would predict is that these guys up here would be the more constrained guys, the high ability guys, right? We said high ability guys should be more constrained than low. And you don't really see that changing much. What's interesting, and I'll point out in a minute, is what's going on. What turns out to be going on is something that's not in the model, but it's not surprising, is what happens up in these highest ability guys is you just all of a sudden a huge gradient in terms of who works well in college opens up. Where there's not much gradient in the NLS Y79 and NLS Y97, there's a huge difference. It's like the high ability, low income guys are working 20 hours a week, and the high income guys are working like 10 hours a week. And they work more weeks as well, the low income guys. So, and in some sense, that's maybe not a terribly surprising response. If the returns to college go up a lot, if you're really smart, you're going to get a lot out of it. So you find a way to go, and either you study, you work hard in order to finance it, or you take less leisure because it's worthwhile. On the other hand, if you're at the bottom end of the distribution, either you can't do it or it's just not that valuable to you.
The evidence on that?
On what?
In other words, it isn't obvious to me that somebody with higher ability gets more out of college than somebody with low ability.
Oh, what's the evidence of that? There is a little bit in the AFQ. I mean, you see a little bit in the AFQT, but you're right. It's actually not that strong. That's true.
I mean, the reason I push that,
I have to be careful.
The arguments for setting a lead admission standard are all contingent on that assumption.
I mean, I guess what you would say is that specification. I mean, what you'll have, like if you run a log wage regression and you throw in AFQT in the intercept, and then schooling, say, as another variable, you'll find AFQT affects income even conditional on schooling, and because of that log separability, it means sort of it's going to be the form that we have in terms of increasing the return for higher. Yeah, I mean, I think there's one thing is true is conditional on your schooling, AFQT does not have huge effects on earnings. It has some. If you ask someone like Salvador, who's prone to extremes, will tell you there's no effect. But if you look at the evidence, there is some effect, but it isn't that great actually. So that, I mean, yeah. One question, and then one way they reconcile the strong relationship between AFQT and schooling is these sort of tastes are high ability guys like school and the low ability guys don't like school. Part of it's going to depend on the curvature of the production function and how elastic earnings are to investments. Anyway, I get a little bit sidetracked here. Okay. Now I got to figure out how to, okay. I got a back button, that's good. So this is where the, sort of that point I made about taste, if you introduce taste to the model, one way to explain those data is high income families value schooling more than others, or that there's a consumption value of schooling, and so high income families pay more. The question is, why did that steepen so much? And that's harder to explain through tastes alone. As I talked about earlier, anything that increases the returns, you would think, because of diminishing marginal utility of consumption, should sort of weaken that relationship between income and attendance, unless you've got some story for why tastes may have become more correlated with income. And obviously, you can explain anything by saying tastes moved in a way to justify the data. I think it's quite possible that played a role. I think it's interesting to think about stories about that, whether sort of the increasing income segregation may have played some role in sort of social networking or what. I think a theory could be written about that. I think one would want to think about the economics of that. But I think, sort of absent a major change in sort of the shift in the way tastes are distributed by income, say, it's hard to explain this relationship without some form of constraint. Whether it has to be a borrowing constraint or some sort of information constraint would be another possibility, that the low-income guys don't know that they have. I mean, another story is costs went up a lot, aid went up a lot, but these low-income guys don't know it. So they just see costs going up a lot. Even if they could afford to go, they don't know it. And now they're not going, whereas the higher income guys don't have to worry about aid. They see the costs go up, but the returns have gone up as well. So, I mean, it's potential. There's some interesting interactions there that I think would be worth thinking about and trying to put some discipline on that problem. But I don't know that we know the answer to that. There's a recent paper by Mike Lovenheim who uses the PSID, and what he tries to do is he looks at sort of business cycle movements in housing values as and housing equity to try and, in some sense, try and pick up some exogenous changes in wealth, and say how does the when housing values go up and families are all of a sudden more wealthy, do they send their kids to college at higher rates? And indeed, he does find that. It's hard to, you can't map this into the last so easily, but a $10,000 increase in housing equity raises college enrollment for kids by about 0.7 percentage point. So this itself suggests, it doesn't tell us what's driving that relationship. It doesn't tell us it's a taste story or constraint story or whatever, but it at least tells us something about this being more than just a correlation, that there's actually something, the choices are actually affected by wealth.
I have a question. I mean, in the time periods where housing equity was raised, maybe also my expectations about future income were different, because, I mean, this might be a period where the economy was doing well. No? So maybe that's also... Well,
he's using local variation across, the variation across local environments. So it's not just at a national level. He's using it over the, I think, 80s, 90s, and 2000s, basically.
So you kind of assume that the expectations overall for future income were the same overall with the housing expectations?
Yeah, you'd have to assume something like, which is probably not too far off, that the market for the labor market is broader than if you're in a housing neighborhood that went up or down. But that's a good question. I mean, one thing that he finds that's pretty interesting is that the housing wealth become a lot more important in the most recent decade than it was in the early 80s or 90s. There's kind of two possible explanations. One is that resources have become more important, sort of a credit constraint kind of story. The other one is just, I mean, it's related in the sense, is just that housing wealth has just become a lot more liquid because of all a lot of the sort of technological innovation in these markets, some of which turned out not to be so good maybe. But at least at the time, it became a lot easier to borrow against your home in order to send your kid to school. So if you have all this housing wealth goes up, but you can't borrow against it, it's not clear it should have much impact on your schooling choices. Indeed, I have some qualms with that story, but for whatever reason, it does appear as though that this has become more important. Yep?
Go ahead.
Somebody.
All right. So in the aftermath of the housing market collapse, based on this result, would it be reasonable to extrapolate to what you would expect less people to go to college?
Yeah, you'd expect, I mean, in the areas where the housing market got hammered, you would expect to go down. I don't know whether anyone's looked at it. I mean, there you've got to worry a lot about the whole economy has moved in pretty dramatic ways as well. It's not, housing market's crashed. You'd want to control for local labor market in an important way. And I forget how he does that here. I think he tries to do it. Whether you find it convincing or not, it's a different question. You can judge that on your own.
This is a question about the way in which the return to college have changed. So one of the things I'm wondering is what's been driving this? What's been driving the increase? So we can imagine a situation in which, say, CEOs. Let's imagine it was all driven by the fact that all CEOs have a college degree. I'm not saying that's true. I'm just, if that was the case, right? And and so what you've got happening is you might be pulling up the returns to it, but you're actually only pulling up the returns for the kind of people who finish a degree and go to get a CEO job, which happen to all be the high wage, the people from high income families in the first place. And then you could even have a sort of an increase in the variance of expected returns, the variance of the returns to college as well.
So I'll tell you a little. I mean, what you tend to see, I mean, over the 80s and 90s, it was pretty broad-based increase in I mean, it's always tricky to know what's going on with the returns because you're trying to figure out what's the counterfactual for any given person, and that's not a trivial problem, let alone doing it over time. So I don't know that we could sort of, anyone could sort of say for sure exactly what happened, say, to the full distribution of returns. I would say that it's certainly the wages of college graduates have gone up sort of across the board. What you see more in the last decade or so, since the late 90s, is really much more skewed at the very high end. So a lot of the inequality in the more recent years is at the very high end, and it's probably more similar to kind of the story you laid out, roughly. But if you look in sort of the 80s and 90s, you would see sort of across the board wages for college guys went up. I mean, the other fact of the matter is a lot of the return is going up because wages of lower educated guys have fallen more so than college guys have gone up so much. So these guys that tell you a college degree isn't worth anything anymore, you can actually sort of make something like that consistent with the idea that the returns of college have never been higher by recognizing that that doesn't mean the earnings of college graduates have gone up dramatically. Indeed, they haven't gone up dramatically. What's happened a lot is if you're a high school dropout, you've just been screwed in the last 20 years. And if you're a high school degree, you've sort of actually lost out quite a bit of ground. So you kind of have this spread where sort of real wage, average wages, I don't think have changed all that much over that time period. So it's really more of a spread in wages than anything.
So I'm looking at this, particularly this last bullet, and as a social worker, I'm like, well, what else is going on? And I'm thinking about the housing market in the 2000s and how lots of people were just buying housing because it became easier, whether they could afford them or not. And I'm thinking about how people who live in houses live in neighborhoods with folks who are more mobile, overly mobile, and maybe are we looking at an issue of like who are you surrounded with, as well as the fact that you now kind of in this better, you have this asset, or is it because that you're in a different school system with more resources? So when you're talking about resources in schooling, not just as a family, but when you moved out of your apartment complex, whether that was a nice complex or if it was a housing project, into this home where property values are there to help run the schools, does that mean you're getting this?
Well, I mean, okay, so you want to think about this as you're in this, I mean, the thought experiment behind this, and how well it does that's a different question, but you're in the same house and all of a sudden the house value goes up. Now, so that's not an issue of moving to a different house. So you don't want to think about it that way, but you do hit on one point that's a good one, and I don't remember what he would have to say about this, which is if your housing value goes up, presumably everybody else's house around you's value is going up, and maybe the schools have a lot more resources, local public, and so you're maybe not just picking up a pure, it's a kind of a wealth, to the extent that communities are deciding what to do with the money, it's somewhat of a wealth effect, but it's a bit trickier than if you just sort of increased one guy's wealth on his own and not everybody else's and not the schools. So he's probably capturing some of that as well. And I'm not sure he would have a way to there would be a way to sort that out here. I doubt he does. I already mentioned this. Let me skip over this, that the effects of family income in terms of whether you work well in school or not increased a lot for these high ability cohorts. So you didn't see the increase in attendance for these guys, increase in the attendance gradients, but you do see a big increase in their work patterns. Let me not spend any dwell on that. The other kind of dimension is, another dimension you might be interested in is what happens to the type of schools people are going to, or school quality. And you see, doing kind of the same thing I showed you before. You can look at attendance at a 4-year versus a 2-year institution, and you see across these two NLSY cohorts that effects of family income become more important for who attends 4-year schools than 2-year schools, consistent with sort of this quality sort of strengthening of the quality relationship that one might expect. interestingly enough, you kind of get the opposite. You get the opposite if you look at what Kinsler and Pavan look at sort of selective high-quality institutions. I forget exactly what their definition is there, but it's going to be based on rankings and I think it's maybe the top quintile. I can't remember. I don't know if anybody knows offhand what they use, but they're going to look at sort of whether you attend a top quality school in terms of four-year institutions for the most part, versus sort of some other school, lower quality schools. And a lot of these top schools are actually private schools. And what they find is actually the relationship between family income and attendance at these top schools weakened across these two NLSY cohorts. And what turns out, what I think is going on, and it's kind of interesting, I don't know what it says about borrowing constraints per se, because of one very interesting thing that took place is tuition at these places skyrocketed, but so did financial aid. So if you look at the price of these institutions, the slope of the price by income, it got much steeper. So the price may not have changed much at all for the low-income guys, whereas it went up dramatically for higher-income guys. So you've got sort of this mixture of price effects that alone would suggest that low-income guys should be, high-income guys should go at lower rates, combined with sort of any sort of liquidity effects that took place. So I mean, it's interesting in the sense that the schools themselves are kind of, it highlights the importance of thinking about the way the financial aid system and the way schools are pricing things also plays a pretty important role, most likely, in the kind of patterns we see. And it's easy to forget that, but I think this is a nice example where it's important.
Can I comment and answer that?
Sure.
One of the things that I found during my career was that these same top schools were waiving tuition for low-income families. So I don't know if that's discussed in this paper, but and then in my experience attending school, tuition jumped something like $7,000 in 1 year. And so I'm just wondering if they're doing this to pay for the people who can pay tuition or whatever, are then paying for those who can't. Did they look at that?
Well, I mean, they're not focusing on that. But certainly what's happening is the sticker price is going up a lot. And the only guys paying that are the high-income guys. And it's not clear the price for low-income guys went up much at all. So the relative price of going to a high-quality school, the price went up a lot for high-income guys relative to low-income guys. So that's sort of one explanation for why they would find that this sort of relationship between income and going to these types of schools flattened. Why it is what it is schools are trying to do, most likely part of what they're doing is raising the price very high for those that can afford to pay anything to pay for those that can't. That's almost certainly part of the calculation. But they're not going into too much that issue. So that's sort of the literature that kind of looks at how does differences by family income play a role, or how important are they. What I would take away from that is not any given pattern at any given point in time, but more how those patterns have changed over time and how we might expect them to change based on different ways of thinking about things. Then there is sort of a different literature, as I mentioned, focused more on the marginal returns to schooling. And Cameron and Tabor, I think, do kind of the nicest job of thinking about this. And they're kind of going to base it on these sort of two predictions. And they basically say, they're going to play off this idea that the response is asymmetric for direct costs versus foregone earnings. And if we change direct costs, that should pick up more constrained guys, because it's going to have a bigger effect on constrained guys than it does for unconstrained guys. So they're kind of going to, I don't want to go into too much detail on this. I don't have time. But they're essentially going to try and sort of look at two different changes. Changes in the cost of the college in the county that you happen to live in as a measure of opportunity cost. And then whether there is a college in your county. So that's sort of a measure of the direct costs, because it's more expensive if you want to go far away. And as a measure of opportunity cost, they're going to use low skill wages in the where you happen to live. What they do, so then they're going to say, okay, we can use IV in this notion of local average treatment effects. The fact that it's kind of hard to explain this in a simple way. If you're familiar with local average treatment effects, it's fairly straightforward. But essentially, the instrument moving direct costs around, whether there's a college around, should be picking up more constrained guys. So if we look at returns to schooling, using that as our instrument, we'd expect to find bigger returns to schooling, a higher marginal return on investment, than using an instrument related to opportunity costs, because that's picking up more unconstrained guys as well. That's sort of the 30-second intuition on what's going on. The bottom line, let me give you the bottom line in the interest of time. They don't find anything that's consistent with these rates of return varying in any way that's consistent with borrowing constraints. And again, they're using the NLS Y79. So that's sort of checkmark 2 is sort of a different set of predictions related to borrowing constraints, also sort of suggesting that borrowing constraints aren't too important for the NLS Y79. Then you've got this sort of a few papers trying to estimate sort of full life cycle schooling models. I won't go into a little bit of detail on these. I think these are interesting, and I think we learned something from them, but I also think they signal some breakdowns in what we need to think more about that I think helps motivate some of what I want to talk about at the last part of my talk here. And they're going to use data on schooling choices, earnings. Sometimes, in the best case scenario, they're going to have data on assets and family transfers, maybe on financial aid, all sorts of things. And they're going to model the whole choice problem. They're going to have to obviously pick an explicit problem. So the Cameron and Tabor, sort of in that same paper I just mentioned, used kind of that same insight of the asymmetry and the impacts of opportunity costs and direct costs. And they write down a life cycle income maximizing model where I choose how many years of school to go to maximize my discounted lifetime income. And what may vary is people face different interest rates. Remember I said earlier on we could think of that as sort of a kind of a equivalent way of thinking about a borrowing constraint. And what they're looking for is there evidence that some people face higher interest rates than others? And then in particular, one of the better ways to think about it is, okay, do groups that we would expect to be borrowing constrained, either low income or minorities, do they seem to have higher discount rates when they estimate their model? So they're basically going to back out the discount rate that would rationalize schooling choices. And consistent with what they found in their IV type strategy, they find no evidence that there's any heterogeneity in these returns, in these interest rates. Again, using this same NLS Y79 data. If you want sort of a more comprehensive model of schooling, work, and consumption decisions, sort of look at Keenan-Wolpin's IER paper. I think it's a very nice model. I think the data is not up to the model. There's a sort of a follow-up paper I'll talk about by Johnson that uses the NLS Y97 and has some better data. So they're able to do a little bit more. But it's based on a similar structure. And they're going to sort of have a discrete choice model. You're choosing between whether you're going to be in school or not, and you're choosing what your consumption, your savings are going to be. You're choosing how much to work, either full-time or part-time. And they're going to have data on schooling decisions, work decisions, wages. And then they observe assets at a couple points in time. Not very many, unfortunately, generally after school is over. So ideally, you'd like to observe their assets in school and follow them over time. They only observe, I think, at around age 25, if I'm correct. Maybe the slide will be clear on that. I think our paper is clear about it anyway. And they're going to allow for unobserved heterogeneity in your ability to accumulate human capital. So that's like the A that we had. So think of one, they're going to sort of make the simple 2-period model I had into more of a life cycle model. And each period are deciding whether to go to school or not. And they're also going to add in a decision for work. And people may be subject to some borrowing limit. People may like school and they might like working or dislike it. So what is the bottom line? I don't have time to go into the sort of whole structure of the model. I think it's a very nice paper to look at the model and see the choices they make and how they model it. But I'm not going to go into all that. What do they find? So the bottom line, interestingly, they find borrowing limits are really tight. People can borrow $600 to $1,000 in 1987 dollars. They don't know the cost of tuition, or they don't use any measure of the cost, but their estimated cost of a semester of school is $3,700. So basically, their estimates imply that people can borrow less than a third of what it costs to go to one semester of school. Of course, there's no way this is right, because we know just by law they could borrow quite a bit more than that. But they're basically their model's saying, well, people are behaving as though that's all they can borrow. So one would expect that credit constraints must really affect schooling. Turns out that's not true in their model. So they can sort of say, okay, we've got estimates of this behavioral model. What happens if we allow people to borrow more? Well, they basically, well, I'll get to that in a second, I guess. What they find to be very important for schooling decisions is parental transfers and part-time work. That's the sort of the way people can afford. They can't borrow very much, so they have to be getting the money somewhere. They're getting it from their parents, and they just model exogenously parents are giving them money. So they find, they don't have data on this. Johnson's going to have some on this. Parents provide between $3,300 and $10,000 in transfers while they're in school. This is per semester, I think. Where those transfers are increasing in parental education. So more educated parents give their kids more transfers. The big thing that drives almost everything is transfers are bigger if they go to school than if they don't. So from the kid's point of view, it's like a subsidy. And those subsidies are bigger for kids whose parents are more educated. So they're essentially going to explain any income attendance gradient, or they don't really have an income, they have sort of a parental education attendance gradient. That's going to be very largely, their estimates are suggesting that's largely driven by these unobserved transfers. Effectively, subsidies are higher. More educated parents give their kids more money to go to school than less educated parents. So what accounts for the differences in educational attainment by parental income? Those are big in the raw data. What's driving it is two things. Basically, these transfers, the fact that more educated parents provide more contingent transfers or bigger subsidies in some sense for their kids to go, and unobserved heterogeneity. Some kids are smart, other kids are dumb, and that drives everything. In many ways, this is fairly dissatisfying. Basically two things the model has nothing to say about. What drives ability differences and what determines why some parents give more to their kids to go to school than not. There's no model of that. So that sort of leads to sort of natural kind of, I think, natural way to progress in this literature. We've been doing some of the stuff I'm not going to talk about today is trying to think exactly about this stuff. What happens if you give more credit to people? Everybody's borrowing. I mean, in their model, a lot of people are up against the limit. You can only borrow $1,000 over the course of your life. That's not very much. Well, they relax credit. It doesn't have much effect on schooling in their model, very small. But you work less and you increase consumption during school. I don't even know if they show this, but it has to have very little effect on utility. So what's going on is essentially they estimate preferences that there's a high intertemporal elasticity of substitution. So in some sense, nobody cares whether they have consumption today, tomorrow, or the next day. So their estimates basically imply if I don't have any money, I just don't consume much today. I still go to school. And I'm going to consume a lot later on. And I don't care that much that I don't get to smooth my consumption because they estimate a very high elasticity of substitution. So relaxing the borrowing constraint isn't going to affect your schooling decision. It's not going to affect your utility very much. It's just going to change where you allocate your consumption and maybe affect when you work a bit. So in the end, they get sort of a lot of people borrowing constrained, but there's very little sort of distortionary impacts. And in part, that has to be true because we know in the NLSY data, income and family income and resources just aren't that related to schooling. So anyway, there's a whole lot of interesting things to think about and how it is they identify things, but I'm not going to go into that. So Johnson, it is a very recent paper. I don't know if it's, I think it's coming out in the Journal of Labor Economics anytime now. Very similar model, but he's going to use the NLSY97 data, and he's got better data in many ways. The NLSY97, these guys learned something and got a lot better data. He's going to model government student loan programs explicitly. That doesn't really require better data. It just requires knowing the rules. So at a minimum, people can borrow the government loan. And then he's going to also include a private limit that he's going to estimate how much private credit they might get. So immediately, they're going to have a lot more credit in his framework than in Keenan-Wolpen, because the loan limits are like $20,000 over your career from the government loan program. He's going to allow for differences in tuition across states, because he's got what state people are in, and he uses the tuition levels within states. He's got measures of aid or of grants that people get, so he's going to estimate kind of the relationship between grant aid and ability and family income. He's going to allow for unemployment, which actually turns out to be pretty important in what he's doing, although it may not seem like it should be. Basically means you can go through periods with very low income. And he's going to exploit some data on tuition by states, some grant aid, parental, and he actually has data on parental transfers. So instead of inferring that by choices, he's going to have measures of how much parents are giving their kids. So he's going to have a lot better shot at really sort of inferring consumption while you're in school, before and after, which is useful for thinking about identifying constraints than trying to just infer it purely from schooling choices and maybe your assets when you're 25 years old. But the bottom line is he's going to find some what sound like pretty similar results. Not quite, though. So again, parental transfers are really important. The fact that they're schooling contingent. So just like Keenan-Wolpen, rich parents give more transfers, and they're more contingent on whether their kid goes to school. So effectively, subsidy rates for college are higher for rich kids, is essentially what the estimates imply. And also, unobserved heterogeneity is really important. So the two things that drove everything in Keenan-Wolpen, all the differences in schooling outcomes, are really the large drivers in this paper as well. He's going to estimate borrowing limits that are pretty modest relative to costs, but they're a lot greater than Keenan-Wolpen. By definition, they're greater just by assumption. Modeling the government loan program gets you a lot more. But then he's going to estimate, even though there's more borrowing, he's sort of allowing for more borrowing, he finds some modest impacts of increasing the loan limits on schooling. So Keenan-Wolpen found basically zero. He finds if you give an additional $1,500 in credit for each year of school in loans, would increase completion rates of college by about 4.5%. Or if you allowed him to borrow the total cost of schooling, would increase completion rates by about 8%. So it's not, I mean, these aren't huge numbers, but they're at least they're non-trivial. And it's all in a context where there's actually more borrowing taking place.
I have a question about between the two papers, because the Keenan-Wolpen mentioned more highly educated parents versus Johnson, which is talking about more families with high income. And just thinking about, especially the recent economic changes, I should say, is, do you notice any nuance between the two, or is the data?
Yeah, I don't know why Keenan-Wolpen looked, well, I'm not sure. I'm not exactly sure why they cut it by education rather than income. Income seems more natural for thinking about some of this stuff, but I mean, I view it as they were treating it a little bit like a long-run income measure, that lower educated guys had long run had lower income, and it's not, it may be a better measure of sort of income over a time period than the income in any given year. So I view these kind of things as trying to get at the same thing, although they're certainly not the same, and that education, more educated parents might value education more than, say, high-income parents if they didn't get the education. So they're not quite the same, but I think it's probably not too far off to think of these as roughly capturing the same thing in these studies.
How about this instead of when you go to wealth, we can know like the price of the housing
Well, certainly the Keenan-Wilpin wouldn't have had that. It wasn't in the NLSY 79, really. In principle, Johnson could have included wealth, some measure of wealth to think about this stuff. In particular, you might want to make the he's not really modeling parents' decisions. Neither of these guys are really modeling parents' decisions. They're treating parents as though there's some transfer to kids, and that just follows some. It's basically a regression of transfers on, well, in Johnson's case, it's a regression of transfers on things like parental income and whether the kid's in school. So there's not a choice being made, and if you start manipulating the environment, like relaxing borrowing constraints or something, it's not clear those transfers wouldn't offset. But these guys are just kind of treating it as some sort of exogenous relationship between these. Now, they could, in principle, have added wealth and sort of said, how does that play a role? I don't know. I'm not sure why he didn't do that. More questions? Yep.
Speaking again about consumption insurance literature, I don't have the best knowledge of what the data would be like, but it seems like if you had, the spirit of this experiment was that if you had some sort of a shock to your incomes, and I could monitor how you responded to consumption, I can use, the classic model and social identifying constraints on outputting credit constraints. Seemingly would be, I don't know, when I studied, you could get data on education, on school attendance as well, or, what's the response to a shock. At least in the toy model we have, it should be true that a shock to my income can, lose my constraint or, I don't know.
The part of the tricky thing is here, you don't have, you do, but you don't have sort of a lot of observations on schooling like you do consumption, where you can look across periods and say, okay, are they smoothing across time? Most of the schooling takes place, it's kind of a one-shot up-front problem. That's optimal in general. That makes it a bit harder to use a lot of those strategies.
Yeah, a lot of them are very much short-term.
Yeah, they're going to, some guy gets a big income boost this time, we know there's a permanent change or a transitory change. I particularly look for some transitory change in income, and do they over-respond to it? You don't quite have that here in the same way. I guess, because you don't get to see them make this choice over and over again so much. Obviously they're choosing to stay in school each period or not, but given the nature of at least the way the labor market treats kind of finishing a program, it pays a lot more than going part way through. The problem looks a lot, you could potentially maybe try to think about dropout decisions or people dropping out and coming back. There's not much evidence that there's a college delay, whether people delay is very related to family income. I don't know if I showed that or not, but we don't have much evidence of that. It's tricky. I agree. I think a real question is whether more insights from that consumption literature can be brought into this literature to think about borrowing constraints and insurance aspects of it, but it really hasn't been yet. So even though these papers kind of have some fairly similar, if you just kind of read the abstracts and you don't think too hard about the papers, you might think they kind of say the same thing. Indeed, they both leave pretty modest and in Keenan-Wilpin negligible impacts of borrowing constraints on schooling choices, but they do it for very different reasons, it turns out. In the Keenan-Wilpin paper, basically everybody's borrowing constrained. It's just that consumption and leisure are distorted, but not schooling. And they estimate this really high intertemporal elasticity, much higher than any consumption literature studies would show. Consumption literature show about a half is intertemporal elasticity. They got something like 2 or 3. So people don't care about smoothing in their framework, or their estimates suggest people don't care about smoothing. So it's not going to be a problem to go to school for a few years and live on nothing because you don't care about smoothing your income. That's essentially what their estimates are suggesting. And their numbers are very consistent with the other stuff in the NLSY 79. It's maybe a little more surprising, at least given what I was suggesting about the NLSY 97, the fact that income looks more important, et cetera. is that Johnson doesn't find a very big role for borrowing constraints. There's some, it's not trivial, but it's not big. And he's got a very different answer. His answer is that people aren't borrowing up to their limits. It's not that everybody's constrained, they just don't care about it in terms of schooling. It's here, people aren't borrowing up to their limit. Indeed, his estimate, if you look at his distributions of what people are borrowing, almost nobody's borrowing more than $6,000. That's just not true. That's sort of some of the stuff I showed you up front, the amount that people are borrowing. Like 20% of the students are borrowing more than $30,000. Most students are up against their limits. Why does he find that? Well, indeed, this comes back to that statement of I said he's got this unemployment in there. Well, if you have enough risk aversion, I don't know if you're used to this consumption literature, or the macro literature, this Iagari and Huggett models and this stuff. If you think about the sort of the natural borrowing limit, et cetera, basically if people are really risk averse, if there's a possibility you're going to earn nothing ever, and you always have to pay back your debts. And if you have an anotic condition where your marginal utility consumption goes to infinity at 0, then if you always have a chance of getting 0 income for the rest of your life, even if it's almost, the really tiny probability, you're still never going to borrow anything because you don't want to go into any debt. He's got something like that taking place. He doesn't quite have an anotic, he doesn't quite have that problem because he's doing a trick, but that's essentially what's going on here. And I'm going to come back to that because so what he's finding is just people don't want to borrow because there's too much risk. So then it's not really that there's a hard borrowing limit. Relaxing how much people borrow doesn't matter because they don't want to borrow. His stuff would suggest you really want to provide some insurance, and then maybe that would be very helpful. Provide some, one thing he doesn't have is he doesn't have any mechanism for insurance. You get a bad earnings outcome. If you raises issues about modeling exactly what kind of insurance there is, either implicit or explicit. You can default on it if you have a bad outcome, or you get some welfare income, or you get unemployment insurance. All that kind of stuff is going to be really important for determining how much debt people are willing to take on, and then therefore whether borrowing constraints are binding or not, or decisions in general. So I think it highlights the importance of that, and I'm going to come back to that because another former Wisconsin faculty member, Salvador, has a nice paper thinking about this. Steve wants me to plug Wisconsin as much as I can.
I want you to plug
Salvador, okay. So implicit in their results is that a lot of youth wouldn't go to college unless they got these contingent transfers from their parents. Basically, their parents are paying them if they go to college, so they're willing to go. Otherwise, they're not likely wouldn't go. So that's playing a big role. So then the obvious question is why is it that wealthier parents are doing more of this? So then the next obvious question, if you sort of want to think about the whole problem, is why is it that the wealthy parents want their kids to go when the kids don't want to go? And in particular, why is it the rich, why is it the wealthy parents in particular that want to do this relative to lower income? If you ask me, that just kicks up the whole problem of income attendance relationships from thinking about it at the kid level and their choice to the parent level. Now we got to explain why wealthy parents want their kid to go to school relative to less wealthy parents, rather than why kids from wealthy backgrounds want to do it. So I don't think it doesn't help us in thinking about what is driving that underlying relationship, the income attendance relationship, and why it's changed over time. I don't see it, I don't see it without thinking more about how do we model that part of the problem.
So is this, even after you take out intergenerational persistence and ability, you still get, so you have two wealthy parents, one of them is low ability, one of them high ability, they both still want their kids to go to.
I mean, they're going to have, they have measures of ability, well, they're going to have unobserved ability in their models that would affect it, and that could be correlated with parental background or parental income. I'm pretty sure I'm almost positive that's true in their framework. So that's part of what's driving things. The relationship in their data, yeah, that's got to be true, is the kids of wealthier families are higher ability. backing that out. So that could be part of the explanation, but even conditional on that. But so then, in a way, you think they're controlling for ability in some sense.
So in a sense, it's like self-phenomenon that ability couldn't explain the whole thing.
Yeah, right. Right. It's still conditional on the kid's ability. The rich parents are willing to give the kid more money than poor parents. So coming to Navarro Salvador's work, he's going to write down a structural model as well, where he's going to think about heterogeneity, really a lot about unobserved heterogeneity and uncertainty, and how we might separate those two things, of knowing whether the distributions, whether individuals know some guys are good and some guys are bad, how much of the distribution of outcomes is due to just people are different and they know it, versus how much is due to the fact that there's a lot of uncertainty and maybe we're all the same and we're just going to get different outcomes and we have no idea who's going to get what. And also borrowing constraints in a life cycle framework. So he's going to combine data from the NLSY 79 and the PSID. And he's got something like the Iagari natural limit that I talk about. You're going to, I mean, you could think about it as there's no borrowing constraint. But in principle, implicitly, there's a borrowing, you can borrow as much as the lowest lifetime income you're going to earn. Now, of course, nobody's ever going to want to borrow up to that, beyond that limit anyway. So in some sense, you don't even need to think about a borrowing constraint in this framework, because it's a natural limit. The key, everything he's interested in, I think is important for some of the discussion where I want to go, is trying to think about it as, separating this heterogeneity from uncertainty. Because this uncertainty is going to be important in terms of how much people are willing to borrow in particular. That plays a key role in the Johnson stuff. So what are his main findings? Well, nobody wants to borrow more than this natural limit, so relaxing that natural limit doesn't do anything. Tightening it might. If you lowered borrowing, you could do something. But more importantly is if you eliminate the uncertainty. So the neat thing that he does, he says, what happens if we get rid of all the uncertainty and let people decide there? So a lot of people are making choices in his model partly on tastes. Tastes are a big driver here, these unobserved tastes. Some guys like it, some guys don't. What he finds is if you eliminate uncertainty, you change who goes, but you don't change average total attendance rate very much, interestingly enough. What's interesting, though, is if you simultaneously get rid of uncertainty and the borrowing limit, this limit that he put at the lowest possible income level, if you get rid of uncertainty, then in principle, and you say people can borrow as much as they want now, you get big increases in college attendance. So this, I think, really nicely highlights what I tried to allude to with the Johnsons. There's really an important interaction between uncertainty and risk that people face and sort of borrowing constraints and their behavior. That is, people may not be up against a constraint if there's a lot of risk. They don't want to borrow much. On the other hand, if you could relax that and there's still that same borrowing constraint for whatever reason, now maybe everybody would be up against it. Begs the question of what's driving that constraint in the first place, and that's where we're going to end today.
Sorry, when you're saying uncertainty, what kind of uncertainty? Is it
there's an earnings process, and I don't know what sequence of shocks I'm going to get.
Okay. And so the tool for removing uncertainty in this model is just like you literally strip it out rather than...
Yeah, it's just purely simulating what would happen in that.
So it would tell us what the effects of labor market insurance.
Yeah, one way to view it is if you could insure everybody against their idiosyncratic uncertainty and still keep them to the whatever contract. So whatever, if there's no moral hazard, no other problems, all there is uncertainty. And if you could sort of provide some insurance against all of that, it would have a huge impact, this suggests.
So this could tell us about, because some countries have got, well, in Britain, for example, if you don't have to pay back your loans unless you're earning above a certain critical threshold. Yeah,
so this is in principle a lot more insurance than that. that's sort of that's a crude sort of way of providing some insurance. Yeah, so one could sort of say, he could simulate. I mean, the nice thing about any of these structural models is you can sort of put on any additional environment you want. You can impose on it and see what the predictions would be. He doesn't do that. My guess is it would be a lot less of an impact than fully providing insurance. But I don't know. Yeah. So I think these studies, in some sense, I think really highlight the importance to think about what's, in some sense, what's this minimal income that people can get, or what sorts of insurance there are, because that's really going to drive borrowing behavior a lot. Not just the minimum, in principle, the whole distribution, but sort of the low end is really quite important. And knowing what that is, if there's a lot of insurance mechanisms to help people out in terms of bad states, then people might be willing to take on a lot more debt and might be more willing to take on the risk of going to college. And in principle, that might be more important in some sense than just sort of allowing them to borrow more. It's possible, because of all the risk, allowing them to borrow more doesn't do much. That's sort of implicitly what Johnson's results say, although he doesn't have nearly enough borrowing taking place to really be consistent with the data. On top of all that is, once you start thinking about why these borrowing limits exist in the first place and where they come from, why is it a lender doesn't lend to some guy, you start coming to conclusions that the amount of risk that's out there is going to affect what they're going to offer someone in terms of credit. Enforcement's going to affect it. All kinds of things are going to affect it. That's what we're going to talk about next. And that is essentially, the private credit offerings are likely to depend on the environment. So sort of anything that could reduce the risk might also affect how much credit people can get. And whether that sort of exacerbates things or shrinks the effects is something one could think about. So anyway, what I think and where we're going in our research, and where I'm going to go in the next short time, is to think about thinking about the insurance and the credit together. I think the literature empirically needs to start thinking more about it, but I think partly we need more theoretical models, more work on it. So there's room for kind of everybody to get involved in this. This is the part I'm going to skip the details on this, but I think the endowments and these adolescent abilities are really important in this model. It's in the Keenan-Wolpen stuff. It's this unobserved heterogeneity in Johnson, these unobserved endowments and types. In the stuff that I showed you, controlling for AFQT as well, this AFQT stuff's really important. These things are really important drivers, whether we look at sort of structural models or reduced form studies, looking at education gaps by this. But most of this literature, in thinking about what's the response of policy, treats all these things as exogenous. This is the distribution of ability. Here's where it is. Who knows where it comes from? I think as sort of a recent literature, if you're familiar with Cunha Heckman stuff, I'm doing some stuff with Betsy Cockett on this. Dalboca, Flynn, and Wiswell have a nice paper thinking about some of this stuff. Thinking about the early investments in the child development, what's determining kids' AFQT scores in some sense, and how those things are related to family income, et cetera, and what role do borrowing constraints and other forms of constraints affect those early investments. And some work we've been doing, we find that these constraints at these younger ages might be more important than even at later ages. But I'm not going to go into that in detail. There's some discussion in this paper. And then just a real quick digression. This empirical literature is, almost all in partial equilibrium, but there's a couple of studies that suggest that if you incorporate general equilibrium effects, and the fact that if you produce more college graduates, if college graduates and high school workers or different skill levels are imperfectly substitutable, if you produce more college graduates, you drive down their wages and drive up the wages of less skilled workers. If you take sort of elasticities that are out there in the literature and you sort of run these models through that, actually these general equilibrium effects are really quite important in that they undo a lot of the partial equilibrium effects. So, and that's sort of, we showed that in a model without credit constraints, and it's sort of a simpler framework, and Gallipoli, McGeer, and Violante have more recent work with a lot of uncertainty. They add a lot of extra stuff to the model. Most of that stuff is not that important relative to this point, and indeed they find kind of the same answer that we find on this point. Then there's sort of two other approaches to thinking about identifying constraints out there, sort of that kind of quite different from anything that we've talked about so far in the model so far, although I guess this one sort of is not too hard to think about. There's this paper by Steinbrückner and Steinbrückner where they basically ask people if they'd like to borrow more money, kind of a novel thing for an economist to do. But he's got this great data on Berea College in Kentucky. It's a special school in many ways. It's all mostly low-income students. They provide free tuition, lots of things. But in many ways, the students' outcomes look a lot like any other low-income background, probably in part because low-income students pay low tuition wherever they go. But they look at dropout. They don't look at attendance. They're looking at students that started at Berea, and then they follow them through. And their question is, if you could borrow, if you could borrow at a reasonable interest rate, would you want to? And if so, how much would you want to borrow? And despite the fact that these guys are living on very little, often like $5,000, $6,000 a year beyond sort of paying for their room and board, only about 20% of them in the survey say they would want to borrow more if they could. So if you just take it directly, that would tell you sort of some number about how many people might be constrained if you believe their answers. And what they do find, indeed, that among those that report, among this 20%, college dropout rates are basically double for those that are in this 20% relative to those that are not, suggesting that the constraint is important in terms of determining dropout, but maybe not that many people, not nearly as many people as one might expect, even among a low-income group, appear to be borrowing constrained by their measure. So a whole different interesting question is why only 20% say that, given they have no money. But that's sort of an issue to be explored, but they don't try to answer that. Is there a question? Did someone have a hand? Yep. Go ahead.
But it's also expected sample, right? Because they asked the people who are already in class.
Yeah, so it's already, so all they can look at is dropout. Yeah, it's a bit tricky to think about. It's
I mean,
if you're borrowing constraint. No, there's a lot of tricky things to actually think about. Because even if you're borrowing constrained, you still chose to go. Their interpretation is if you're borrowing constrained, you may be closer to the margin. Anyway, I think that the general approach is kind of an interesting one, and might be a more interesting one to think about it if you could sort of measure it at people deciding, look at high school kids and get at it. But it's not as easy to do in that context either, because then you're asking them conceptually, if you could have access to more credit, I guess you'd want to ask, would you want it, and would that change? And then trying to think about whether that affects whether they go or not. A very different paper, and is kind of nice for a lot of reasons I'm not going to talk about, is by Brown, Schultz, and Seshadri. I'll let Steve say that Schultz and Seshadri are at Wisconsin still. And Brown was. They are going to think about it in an intergenerational way. One of the only papers to do this, except for all these stuff on early childhood, that literature is thinking more about it. But they explicitly are going to drive intergenerational relationships. And I think they have kind of an interesting way to think about borrowing constraints. And they're basically going to, this is a bit strong, you wouldn't need to do this, but they're going to basically say every kid, if on their own, would be borrowing constrained. Not necessarily true, but I don't think that's crucial to most of the line of thinking. And parents can borrow freely, but they can't write enforceable contracts with their kids. They might want to. Ideally, they would. So they could borrow for their kid to go to school and pay for them, but they're not guaranteed to get the money back from the kid. So then the issue is some parents might not want to give their kids as much money as it would take for them to go to college, because their kids are going to be successful already, or they don't have much to give and they want some of that money. If they could write a contract with their kid to pay them back, everything would be great. Of course, then you'd ask why a bank can't do that. So those families that you know, don't want to transfer enough, they're going to give as much as they can when the kid's in college. But their kids are, because their kids aren't getting enough money, they underinvest in their education. On the other hand, families that are not up against this constraint, those guys are going to transfer money to their kids in college, and then they're also going to transfer some money when their kids are done with school as well. So that's the thing they're going to look at empirically, is they're going to think about constrained people and unconstrained people based on whether they receive any transfers after school.
Is the limited commitment really important for the parents constrained? You can see that if there's altruistic constrained parents will have the same issue.
Oh, the commitment's crucial here. I mean, if you're altruistic, you still might not want to give too much to your kid. If you could give them more and get the money back, then there'd be no problem here. There'd be no distortion.
If the parent is borrowing constrained, then...
No, if the parent's borrowing constrained, yeah, so here implicitly the parents can borrow as much as they... So if the parent's borrowing constrained as well...
I misunderstood unconstrained families.
Yeah, no, but here I mean basically it's transfer constraints binding or not binding. Sorry. So they also, in their framework, and like I said earlier, you can derive this in a lot of frameworks, but not everyone, they find that human capital investment should be more sensitive to tuition subsidy among constrained youth than among unconstrained youth. So if you're borrowing constrained, you're more responsive to a subsidy. So they look at some, they look at some HRS data, which is data that's very bad, looking at old guys and their kids basically, where they have measures of these family transfers and the kids' educational attainment. And they basically look at whether, I don't want to go into too much detail. That's not the nicest part of the paper, to be honest, but it's nice, it's interesting. But they basically find among that group that they call constrained, more aid has an extra $3,600 in aid, the way they calculate it, increases average schooling by 1/5 of a year. And you have basically no effect of more aid on unconstrained by their measure. So I think this sort of way of thinking about it could be used in a lot of other contexts, a lot of other policy changes besides. They're basically looking at if you have a bunch of kids in school at the same time, they get more financial aid than if they're spaced apart. And that's their sort of exogenous variation in aid that they use. But I think you could use lots of other sources of variation. If you have, the data demands are pretty heavy though. You need this intergenerational stuff, and you need transfers over a long period of time. I think it's a neat paper, and I think there's some neat stuff about thinking about the intergenerational dynamics and the gaming part of things. That's a nice contribution, separate from everything I pointed out here. So that's a nice paper in those dimensions. So this is my take on it, and this is sort of a, other people may have a different interpretation of everything I just said. But I would say I think it's pretty clear across the board. Any study that looks at the NLS Y79 finds no evidence really consistent with borrowing constraints affecting college going. Keen and Wilpin argue borrowing constraints affect other choices, but not schooling. So in the early 80s, looks like very few borrowing constraints. I would argue since then there's been a lot of changes that point to the fact that more families may be constrained. There's sort of more students maxing out their government loans. There's this doubling of family income and college attendance has gotten a lot more strongly related. You see the low income students are working much more than high income students among the high ability groups as well. All of those are kind of things that would that's changed a lot. So that's consistent with borrowing constraints having become more important. If you want to look at the school quality, that's kind of more mixed. If you look at attending a 4-year college versus a 2-year, that seems consistent with kind of this stuff up here. On the other hand, this stuff by Pavan and on Kinsler's kind of goes the other way. At very selective schools, that doesn't seem to be the case. And largely, I think, because the price has gone up a lot more for high-income kids than low-income kids. I don't know if I showed this, but there's basically neither data set shows much effects of family income on college delay. So whether you start school a year later, take a year off or two or not. And the structural, one of the sort of conclusions I think from the structural stuff is that, thinking a lot, the parental transfers are really important and this labor market risk are pretty important. And I think both of those complicate sort of how we want to think about some of these issues and how we want to measure it. And I think that, make sort of those studies a bit limiting in what we learn from them, but I think they sort of lead the way into things we need to think more about in terms of future work. So I'm going to skip this whole section. Any questions on that? If you want to debate me on the interpretation, maybe we can do that later. But any questions on that? Okay. So then the last part, what I wanted to do is spend some time, we'll see how much I get through here, but thinking about constraints more seriously. Right now, we really this is the way the literature has treated them until recently. So I don't want to apologize for that, but I think we want to think more about constraints, and as well as about uncertainty and insurance aspects in these contracts. I just skipped a whole section here I didn't want to skip. All right, sorry. So a lot of this is from this AER paper with Alex Monghay. We surveyed in this annual review paper, so that's enough for you unless you're really interested in it. We sort of want to argue that thinking more about these constraints actually leads to some useful insights. And actually helps us think a little bit about policy in some important ways. The first thing to note is that government loan programs look nothing, well, they don't look nothing like, they look quite different from some upper limit on borrowing. And that is they're different in two really important ways. Well, let me say, I'll be explicit about it in a second. But essentially, they link how much you can borrow to how much you're investing. If you don't go to college, you can't borrow from the Stafford Loan Program. If you go a year, you can borrow something. You go 2 years, you can borrow more. If you don't spend that much on your school, you can't borrow that much. And then there's also this hard cap that looks more like this exogenous limit that the government imposes. So I'll sort of say what I think. I'll show you sort of a very crude approximation to what these look like in a minute. Private lenders, there's no reason to think they would do anything like this either. Allow everybody to borrow some amount regardless of what they do with the money. We're going to try and think about private lenders as facing a limited commitment problem. There's some commitment problem with the individuals might want to renege and default on them. And they want to determine how much people are good for in some sense. And we would expect, and I think there's evidence of this, it's not quite as, I think there's sort of a lot of scenarios where this is roughly true. I don't think they do as nearly as clean of a job as we would expect them to do maybe. But there's sort of plenty of sort of evidence that suggests that they extend credit based on the prospects of repayment and projected future earnings. That is, they've always been in the market for lawyers, doctors, business MBAs. They've always given loans out to them. No surprise, those guys earn a lot of money later on. When they came in the undergraduates, they started off at the top schools and public schools. When the market went to heck, they got out of the market for community college students. So there's a lot of sort of things that suggest they're not arbitrary in who they lend money to. Whether they do it as well as we're going to assume they do is a different question. So what do government programs really look like? Well, it's tied to investment. So you can borrow in principle up to the cost of college, room and board. There's a sort of a bunch of other expenses implicitly in there, less any other financial aid. We're going to abstract from that for now. But it's also subject to some upper loan limit. That was that table I showed you, how much you could borrow each year for a total of, say, $23,000. And they also sort of have stronger enforcement than do private lenders, although it's a little unclear how that plays out. But we're going to sort of, in the paper in the AER, we basically assume they fully enforce it, which isn't quite true. But we're going to assume it's stronger than private lenders. So here's a very crude approximation to what the government loan program looks like. You can borrow up to the minimum of your expenditures, your direct cost expenditures. Tau time, remember, tau is sort of your direct cost per unit of investment. and some upper loan limit. And we're going to basically implicitly assume they can, you have to repay everything. You can't renege on the government. What about private lending? Well, I want to think about it as sort of a limited enforcement problem. So a lender's only going to lend to someone if they, well, actually, that's stepping ahead. A borrower is only going to repay his loan if repaying it's cheaper than just defaulting. So he'd rather default if that's better for him. Lenders, they're not idiots. They can look at borrowers and figure out how much, at what point they're going to renege on the loan and limit credit to the amount that will be repaid. So here it's key that there's no uncertainty. So they can perfectly figure out there's no unobserved heterogeneity, inability, nothing here. I think those are all interesting things we'll talk about at the end. But this is sort of easiest to build some intuition here. Well, to the extent that default is sort of imposes a larger cost, say they seize your earnings or whatever, some of your earnings, to the extent that the default is more costly for people with high earnings, then we would expect credit to be related directly to what people think your future earnings are going to be. And because expected earnings are going to depend on how much school you get, how smart you are, what college major you choose, what institution you go to, anything that affects your future earnings, we would expect these things to all be co-determined in equilibrium. Turns out it's pretty, in a very simple case, it's really easy to think about how much credit someone can get. If we assume that the only, if you default on your loans, what your cost is, you basically have to give up a fraction of your earnings, kappa tilde. Well, borrowers repay if the amount that they owe is less than kappa tilde times their earnings. Well, you can easily rearrange that thing, and you get a simple equation that tells you how much private lenders are going to be willing to lend someone. Basically, a fraction of their discounted future earnings, kappa tilde. So if you if you want to default on the guy, you have to give this up. So as long as what you have to repay is less than that, you'll repay. So no private lender is going to give you any more than that because they know you're going to run off on them. So it's pretty obvious here. So think of this as the D bar, only an endogenous limit on what private lenders are willing to lend you. It's clearly increasing in your ability or anything. The ability here is just to stand in for anything. It could be the type of school you go to, your major, et cetera, anything that affects your earnings power. And your human capital investment. It's increasing in both of these things. So in this simple framework, basically the total credit limit is just the sum of these two. You can borrow from the government and from private lenders. So you sort of have a total credit limit that would look something like this. And you could sort of solve the individual's decision problem that we laid out before, maximize discounted lifetime utility, subject to your consumption allocations and this new borrowing limit. So if these government student loan repayments are fully enforced, as this shows, there's no crowd out of private credit from government. You extend you extend the government loan program, you're not going to reduce any private credit. So that wasn't quite true in what we saw. Well, I have to be careful. I don't want to say that. This is just in terms of the amount of credit. It could be perfect crowded in how much you borrow almost, or who you borrow from, but not necessarily in how much credit you can get.
Are you guys thinking that crowding out is potentially a problem, why we don't see very much private student debt?
What's interesting, what I think is the case is if the government provides a lot of credit, private creditors might be willing to lend a lot, but nobody's going to show up at their door. Everybody's going to take it from the government. So there's no reason for them to set up any types of programs. I'm kind of telling you where I'm going to go. But on the other hand, if costs start going up and the demand for credit starts to exceed what the government can provide or is willing to provide, you would expect private lenders to pop in and provide credit along these lines. So is it sort of a distinction between kind of, how much credit that's offered but nobody ever uses in some sense, and what's really sort of available. And here we're sort of modeling in some sense what's available. One might also sort of say, okay, maybe nobody ever takes this up on it because the government provides enough. And the government sort of has a little bit of an advantage because they've got more enforcement or whatever, so they can do it more cheaply. Turns out this very simple constraint, you actually get something very similar if you write down a full life cycle model. And you assume that your punishment for defaulting is not only you lose a fraction of your income, but you also get shut out of borrowing and lending. You can't borrow for a certain amount of time. So in our AER paper, we sort of go through all those details, and you actually get something that looks a lot like this, although you get a little bit of partial crowd out in that environment, in part because in that case, if you borrow a lot from the government, the fact that they can always take that money, you have to pay that back, has a little bit of an effect on your incentive to repay private lenders because of this sort of smoothing function, the fact that you get shut out of these credit markets. If the only punishment is this, you lose a fraction of your income, I think there would be no crowd out. I have to think more about that. But in general, you might expect some crowd out. If carrying a lot of government debt somehow makes you less likely to pay private lenders back. If there were rules in there that says private lenders can't take all of your income, can only take kappa if you have so much resources. So they can't, if there are rules that says you can't drive a guy's income below the minimum wage or something like that, then those kind, or you can't drive their assets below some amount, then you're going to start to get crowd out more generally. So I don't think the no crowd out is always going to be the case. In general, I think there's lots of reasons to expect some crowd out. Although in general, I don't think you're going to get full crowd out. So expanding government loan programs, you would think, provides an increase in total credit available, which is important. So as I said, we kind of show quantitatively, at least it's sort of roughly consistent with kind of some of the facts I laid out. And our kind of story is this. If you look in the early 80s, the government provided a lot of credit, enough to cover everybody in terms of what they needed, so there was no real need for the private sector, very little private lending. There's no income attendance relationship, et cetera. The fact that costs and returns have gone up make more people want to borrow more. If government doesn't expand its limits, it starts to push people up against those, and now they pushes them into the private sector. And if the private sectors can respond by providing some credit. The fact that the returns to college have gone up means, in some sense, they can provide even more credit than otherwise because people are better for it now. If they're earning more, they can handle more debt. What we would need is that they haven't responded enough to satisfy everybody's needs, such that there's still some people borrowing constrained that weren't before. So maybe less than if the private sector weren't engaged, but some people, there's still some limit. So that's kind of our story in that paper of what kind of went down. There's kind of a lot of other interesting, I think, things that come out of this framework. And one is that the way the government student loan program and also the private lenders link credit to investment shifts some of the distortionary effects of constraints onto consumption rather than on a human capital investment. If the only limit that's binding is you can't borrow more than you spend on college, so if that upper bar on government loan limits, if upper limits on government loans are really high, then in some sense you get no distortionary effect on schooling. Because every additional dollar I want to invest in my human capital, I can borrow it. So there's no cost in terms of reducing my current consumption. The only margin that gets distorted in that world is your consumption. You just have to live on whatever you got during that period. But you don't, by investing less, you don't have anything more to go with. So in that world, you can get completely unconstrained human capital investment amount, even though people are constrained. So it's kind of it distorts things because the more you invest, the more you can borrow. It relaxes that sort of it relaxes the burden on human capital investment and education choices. It also means that more able people can borrow more. And that sort of tends to create a stronger relationship between ability and human capital investment, even among borrowing constrained people. Something I skipped over a little bit earlier. It's actually hard in an exogenous, this fixed upper limit model that I started off with earlier in the day. You actually tend to get this perverse relationship that ability should be negatively related to human capital investment if people, given sort of standard estimates of taste for smoothing consumption. Whereas you can undo a lot of that with these endogenous limits. What's more interesting, I think, is that now you get not only does anything you do with the government sector is also going to affect what private creditors are going to do. So you can start thinking about how would we expect the private sector to respond to expanding government loan limits or providing subsidies for education. And there we do a few different simulations, but basically we said there's some crowd out, but it turns out to be pretty modest. So increasing government loan limits would increase total credit available and increase human capital investment among those that are constrained. You also have this interesting effect that if you subsidize education, by encouraging human capital investment, you also relax credit constraints even further and provide more credit, so you get a sort of an additional credit expansion effect on human capital investment. So now if you invest more in your skills, the private sector is willing to lend you more. That enables you to invest even more than you would have otherwise. So you can get sort of bigger bang out of government policies because the private sector is kind of working in tandem with the government sector. And there's one sort of other interesting, I think, policy or sort of policy way to think about it. If you think about the trade-off between, well, should we just provide the private sector with more enforcement? That will allow them to provide more credit. If you increase the enforcement, capitilda, the money they can take if you default, then they're going to lend more. Should we sort of think about policies that sort of work on that margin or just work on the government student loan margin? And it turns out they have different effects on who invests, or they have different effects on different types of people. And maybe it's not surprising, but expanding the government loan program tends to have bigger effects on the lower ability guys. And changes in private enforcement tend to impact the most stable. And that's not surprising because you want to lend more to the most stable, and they've got more money to take. So if you allow people to take a larger fraction of income, that's going to sort of a larger fraction of a bigger amount is going to be bigger. So that extends the private credit limits greater for high ability guys than for lower ability guys. So that's all within So that's all. It's all actually fairly simple in a world without any uncertainty. But if you want to think about uncertainty, if you think the world's uncertain, the problem becomes a lot harder, but it becomes a lot more interesting. Policy is not really that interesting in that last environment because you can always ensure full credit to everybody if you just punish the heck out of them when they default. If you send capital to 1, so anytime you default, we just take all your money. Obviously, nobody's ever going to default, and you can ensure full unconstrained behavior. Well, there's a reason we don't do that, and that's because do you really want to punish the guy that can't find a job and send his consumption to 0? Not really. Typically, we want to provide some insurance for those guys that have a bad outcome. So then we want to think a little bit about, but once you start thinking about that, you have all these sort of competing things going on in terms of you want to provide credit to people, you want to provide some insurance, but if you provide too much insurance, maybe you run into moral hazard problems, etc. So there's lots of interesting things about introducing uncertainty. You can get default very easily out of these types of models. There's a trade-off between sort of enforcing repayment in all cases and then providing insurance against these sort of bad outcomes. So we want to think a little bit about limited commitment in kind of a world with uncertainty, and then very quickly about a little bit about some stuff with private information, moral hazard and costly state verification models. We're thinking about adverse selection as well. Dean Corbet is doing some stuff on this right now with Andy Glover, and I don't know if he'll talk about it in the upcoming days or what he's talking about. But I see he's talking again.
Forgive my interrupting. We have about 15 minutes left, and unfortunately I have to be briefed on schedule.
Okay, perfect. So now we're going to strip this model down a little bit further and get rid of the foregone earnings and set tuition cost to 1. And we want to add uncertainty to the problem. So for now, this price of human capital, W1, can take on n different values. It's discrete. It doesn't need to be discrete, but for whatever reason it is. I'm going to make it continuous in a little bit. Everybody knows everyone knows these probabilities and this distribution. Ability is fully observable, or everybody's wealth is fully observable. Obviously, those are other dimensions you might want to play with. Dean's stuff is thinking a little bit about that. So now, preferences, you just want to maximize expected lifetime utility. This is just all a rehash of everything earlier. Just to remind you, the problem, if we think about it in a complete markets world where there's essentially full insurance, you can think about it as sort of these arrow contingent claims. I can make a promise. Basically, you can think of individuals when they're going to school as promising to pay someone back DI for every state I. So if I'm in a crappy period, I'm not going to pay you back much, or you're going to pay me. If I'm in a good state, I'm going to pay you back a lot of money. Those are and Q is the price of those things. And your consumption when you're out of school is basically your income less whatever you promised to pay back. We'll assume these prices on these contingent claims are just risk neutral. So the lender has kind of the same discount rate as the individual. Well, it shouldn't be too surprising. I'm not going to spend any time on it. But in this world where there's these complete contingent claims, so you can insure against everything, human capital maximizes the expected lifetime value of income instead of just the actual value now. So it's basically analogous to our unconstrained problem earlier. You equate the expected marginal return with the marginal cost. And your preferences, your wealth, how much risk there is irrelevant for your human capital investment. You just maximize expected lifetime income, and then you're insured against all the good or the bad. And you get to optimally smooth your consumption. Now, what happens if we sort of say, now we're going to think about some of these commitment problems we had before. So now assume you can default on your debt in that second period if you want to, if it's advantageous. There's this value of default that depends on basically on all three of these, your earnings, or your wage realization, your ability, and your human capital. And now you're going to repay in the second period if your utility is greater than your utility of reneging and defaulting. So D is what you pay in state I. I'm going to repay in state I if I'm better off than defaulting. So this is going to constrain how much lenders are going to let you, how many of these promises they're going to buy from you. If we sort of set up the punishments or what your value of default is the same way we did before, they just take a fraction of your income, then you get these just very nice simple borrowing constraints or solvency constraints. I can sort of promise to repay you some amount DI, and that has to be less than some fraction of your income in that state. Interestingly enough, these constraints are going to bind for high realizations of income. I'm not going to go into it, but basically they can't commit to pay back enough in high earning states. You're going to want the allocation is going to be, well, when you get a really good realization, you got to pay us back a lot of money to cover you for those bad realizations when you don't have to give us very much back. Well, if I got to give you a lot of money back and I can just run away with giving up some of my income, then I'm going to run away in those states. So now you don't get perfect smoothing anymore. You're going to get perfect smoothing in sort of the low earning states, and the high earning states you're going to have sort of imperfect insurance. And you could show you're going to get underinvestment in human capital if any of these constraints bind. So if any potential state of the world you might default, lenders are going to not allow you to borrow enough against those states, and you're going to underinvest in your human capital. So this has a lot, and it's very similar to sort of the whole structure I went through with full certainty. Constraints imply underinvestment in human capital. Human capital investing more means you can borrow more again in different states, or against basically allows you to borrow more or take on more promises to repay. It encourages investment in this leads to this credit expansion response that I talked about. Again, you don't get any default in equilibrium because lenders know what you're willing to repay in every state of the world, so they're never going to lend you more in some sense against those states. So you don't get anything like a default, which we see in the data. And again, it's really simple. The policy situation in this world is just jack up the punishment as large as you can, and nobody ever defaults. So then you could sort of have full insurance. So that's kind of not a particularly interesting framework for thinking about policy, but it's kind of a nice benchmark. So now we could sort of say, well, suppose we're going to sort of make these markets incomplete. So suppose you can't make contracts for every state. You can only borrow some amount and promise to repay that back. Well, now we're going to get default that occurs. And we're going to think about the same punishments for default as we've been thinking about before. So let big D be the amount that you promise to repay if indeed you repay your amount. So here you're either going to repay some amount or you default on your loan. Well, again, you repay if your repayment is less than what they can take if you default. So that gives you sort of gives you a threshold on your earnings realizations. If your earnings are below some level, you get a bad draw, you're going to default. A good draw, you're going to pay your loan back. In the interest of time, let me not go too much into this. Basically, the amount of credit you're going to get is going to not only be what you promised to repay, but that's going to have to subtract off all the expected amount you're going to default on. So you get even though you're going to pay back $1,000, they might not let you borrow, $900 because they know half the time you're going to run away. So maybe they only let you borrow, they only give you $500 in order to pay back $1,000. And half the time you don't pay anything back, and they see some of your income. The other half you pay the $1,000. Something like that. More importantly, for investment, you get kind of an interesting problem. So if this whole thing's 1, we're just like in the fully insured environment, complete contracting environment. So you've got sort of 3 kind of distortions playing around here. One is that human capital is risky. So that discourages investment. In some states of the world, you're going to have fairly low income, and paying back a lot of money sucks in that. So that discourages investment in human capital, and that relates to kind of this term up here. Also, some of the benefits of investment are lost if you default. So if you default, they take some of your income. So you're only earning you're not earning the full return on your investment because some of that's being taken by the creditor. That also discourages investment. And then there's some last effect that actually encourages investment because as you invest more, you can promise to pay back more. So the creditor is going to lend you more. So there's sort of this third effect, and at the end of the day, you're going to have to sort of balance all of these to know whether investment's higher or lower. Potentially you could actually have higher investment in this world than the unconstrained amount. It's kind of nice for thinking about interest rates. You could think now you get an interest rate schedule. That is, if you're likely to default, you're going to have to pay a high interest rate. And your ability is likely to affect it. High ability guys are going to basically pay a lower interest rate on any loan, which further increases investments in human capital. So you kind of get some interesting implications for the role of ability. But the fact that your higher ability, the fact that you're investing more and taking on more debt could also increase the probability to default in the end. So you get sort of some complicated relationships between how things like ability affect default, that it's not sort of necessarily monotonic. So some nice things about this is you can get default in equilibrium. That's kind of a nice feature. We'd like a model that delivers that. If default happens, it happens in bad states of the world. That's also kind of nice. Default plays an insurance role in this aspect, so you don't want to eliminate default necessarily. You want to allow in some cases, you want to allow for default. So this is sort of a much more interesting sort of environment to start thinking about what's the right policy prescription. But here sort of the markets are in, the downside is sort of, you're just sort of ruling out all sorts of contracts without any reason. Just assuming, well, you can't make contingent contracts for whatever reason. Be nice to think about that more, you know, where that comes from, or what's driving that. And there leads us to start thinking about sort of imperfect information. Let me just go through moral hazard, because I can do that fairly quickly and give you a little intuition, and then I'll wrap up. So now I'm going to move to continuous distribution for W1, and you can just sort of add. You can add an effort choice that's unobserved. It's, you know, you can think of it here. It could be your effort during school. It's going to affect the effort's going to affect the distribution of wage outcomes you get. So it's generic. The way it's written is generic enough. It could be a search effort, like how hard you're going to look for a job, or it could be how hard you study and whether you sort of really are going to find a good job at the end or a bad job given your human capital investment. So we also have everything we had before, the human capital investment, but now we have this effort, and people don't like effort. Cost is higher for high effort than low effort. Well, you can write down that problem. Let me not go into the detail, but basically you have a break-even constraint that the lender can't lose money on you. And then there's this incentive compatibility constraint that says, you know, putting forth the high effort has to be optimal for the individual, that you have to set up the repayments such that they're happy to put forth that high effort. You're going to distort consumption in this environment. So you're going to have to provide, when people have a good earnings outcome, you're going to have to give them a little more than if they have a bad earnings outcome. Otherwise, nobody would bother to put forth the effort. They just tell you they did. On the other hand, if it's optimal to produce the lowest effort, guys can do that and they can get full insurance. So you sort of got to, if you want to put forth the effort, you're going to have some imperfect insurance. On the other hand, if it's optimal for you to put forth lowest effort, you can do that and you can provide full insurance. Well, it turns out the interesting thing is in terms of investment in this model is what you get is investment. You look at this. This looks a lot like the optimal, the investment in the complete contracting environment, complete contingent claims. That is in full insurance. And what you have is, as long as you can implement the right amount of effort for a person, you can implement, the guy's going to invest the right amount in his human capital. Turns out the low wealth guys are the ones that you can most easily get them to exert the low effort. There's going to be some group of middle or high wealth individuals that might be dissuaded from choosing the high effort because they don't have that full insurance, whereas they have full insurance in a low effort state. So they may choose low effort due to the moral hazard. And to the extent that they choose low effort, they're also going to invest less in their human capital than would be optimal. So you get sort of lower investment in human capital for these guys, and it's sort of sort of an inefficiently low amount. And then there's high wealth, really rich guys. They don't care about the income so much. They don't want to produce the effort. That's too costly. So those guys produce low effort. They invest less. They invest the optimal amount given low effort, but that's less than if they exerted high effort, and they get full insurance. So to the obvious, you know, if you think about it for a second or two, this predicts actually investment and effort should be decreasing in wealth, conditional on ability, rather than increasing. So that's a little bit of a, I guess, a little problematic, unlikely to stand up in empirical studies. What I think is interesting, I mean, so what we're trying to think about and where we're going with this is to think about, you know, what should the, you know, as soon as we have uncertainty and we have some other problems, either limited commitment problems or we have moral hazard problems or adverse selection or anything, how, in these kind of environments, how would we want to set up credit contracts? And you may believe there's credit constraints or not. In some levels, the question still remains, how would we want to set those up? We know there's not full insurance. That's for sure. How much insurance could we provide? How would that affect credit contracts? How would it affect investments in human capital and who invests? Inequality and all these things are what we're after. So I think there's a lot of work to be done. If you look at the sort of the general questions, I think that remain. I mean, it's kind of almost everything is still wide open. Instead of just, I think it's important to go beyond just are people constrained or not, or how many people. Start asking, how much credit should different types of people be getting? Do some people get too little credit? Are they constrained? That's one. A lot of literature is focused on that. But then there's this whole issue of are some people getting way too much credit, and they're being let off the hook ex post and not repaying, and you're sort of essentially over-subsidizing school for a lot of inefficient types of behavior, like the art history student who borrowed $100,000 and there's no chance they're going to pay it back. Should the government be doing some of this is a reasonable question. Should they be offering different amounts of credit to students choosing different majors or with different SAT scores? What should credit actually depend on? I think these are important questions that the government should think about, but also private lenders are almost certainly trying to think about this stuff now. Beyond sort of how much money you want to give a student for school, how do we want to structure those contracts? What kind of insurance do we want to provide? That's important to think about how much ex-ante heterogeneity there is versus ex-post uncertainty. We need to separate these two things out to make any sort of statement on that. So there's a sort of Jim's work with Salvador and Flavio and others starts to get at that. This is really important for thinking about the importance of all of this unobserved heterogeneity, this uncertainty, the role of adverse selection and moral hazard. All that stuff is going to be, we need to know a lot more about this. Commitment problems, how important are they? These other kinds of problems. All of these, I think, we don't know as much about as we should in this market, both empirically and how they play out in terms of optimal contracts. And then, if you sort of ask, to what extent you start thinking about this, and you realize that so much depends on what really leading to natural questions of how do we tie credit and schooling policies to other social insurance programs, unemployment insurance. Should we be thinking about all of this as one big problem to solve? Or at a minimum, given unemployment, the structure of unemployment, or given the structure of welfare programs, that might affect how we want to set up the loan contracts in the first place. So even if we don't want to think about it all at once, even if we think about one piece of the pie, we need to think about the other piece as well. And then kind of ultimately, I think one has to ask, what role should the government play in some of these markets versus the private sector? Do we just give the private lenders the same power as the government and let them do it? Or are there lots of other restrictions we'd want to impose? And I think there's tons of work to be done here. So let me end with that. Yep.
On this, it seems to me that it's crucial, where we put the uncertainty. When we want to distinguish the heterogeneity from the uncertainty, very often we tend to think that basically the information that is available to the econometrician is the same that the one that is available to the agent. But it might well be that the agent might learn about himself over the life, for example. And then in this case, the uncertainty might be due to the fact that I was not expecting the crisis, and so my return either went down from what was expected, but it might also be that I really don't know what my return would be, even if I know exactly how much a college graduate from Chicago is going to earn over the 20 years, and this as a function of ability, but I don't know which is my ability. I have just an imperfect signal, which is how I did in high school or something like that. And moreover, I don't have any idea of what is my counterfactual. What if I would have been a manufacturer worker in a firm? What would have been my wage? So in this case, it seems to me that in order to characterize, given that those are very hard problems, even just in theory, where we put the uncertainty is key in determining the solution. And I'm not much aware of empirical much of empirical literature that try to address these things.
I think in terms of a lot of the modeling, if the agent, the key is whether the agent knows it or not. Whether there's guys that are smart and guys that are dumb, and what's important is, do the individuals know that themselves? And then that's one problem. and maybe the lender doesn't know it, so then you're in an adverse selection kind of environment? Or is it that the individuals themselves don't know whether the smart guy or the dumb guy? And I think in those environments, that's not much different from saying there's one type of person and there's two types of outcomes that are going to happen. Whether it's really up front, everything could have been known if we somehow knew that. Unless we could sort of somehow figure out who is which guy, I don't think it matters whether you model it as at time 0, there's a whole range of abilities, but nobody knows which guy they are, or at time 0, everybody's the same ability and there's a whole range of outcomes. Unless there's sort of a sequence of events along the way where there's learning that's taking place along the way, then obviously it starts to matter.
No, but let's say, like, for example, the interplay with wealth, it seems to me like, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but it seems to me likely that, like, a person that comes from a low-wealth family/environment is more likely to underestimate his ability, whereas, like, a smart person is more likely to overestimate his ability. Like, come on, I'm a kid of two, like, university professor, I can't be that stupid. Or I am born in a crappy environment, I've been to bad schools, I must be kind of not that smart. Like, it seems to me that it's hard to empirically to say, is it true this, or is it just me making up a story a little bit the extreme? Or is it true empirically that people have different priors in some systematic ways on their abilities?
I think you're definitely right. I was involved in a mentoring program in my high school, and I've been talking a lot to students, and it's really interesting exactly what you mentioned. So when you talk to students and ask them, okay, what are your plans for the future, many students with the same grades in high school would answer really differently depending on where they come from, and I think it has a lot to do with what the parents' expectations are and how well the parents do. So thinking what you're raising is really important.
Well, I think I'm going to have to intervene given the binding constraint of the wait, just a few more minutes. I've been away for a while. You can break in as fresh as you leave here. No, I don't want to. I think you can answer this, right?
Well, I don't know if I have an answer.
I'm sorry. I thought you were making an observation. Well, no, but it's an observation that requires an answer.
Well, what kind of answer are we looking for here? I think.
Well, it's a role of the family in general, and we're talking about building expectations and encouraging, but also just generally about the financial ones that the family provides. Networks the family provide, guarantees. I'm curious what you think about it. I know your work as well. I'm curious about what you're.
I think, I guess I think about these whole problems as largely a family unit making them, these choices and decisions. I mean, I think there's presumably some insurance going on within the family, and that's the one thing that is left out of a lot of this stuff. One thing we've looked at data from the Canada Student Loan Program and who defaults on goes delinquent and defaults on that, and one of the really interesting things, biggest things we found is that a lot of it's driven by basically people that have a low income outcome and report that they couldn't get any money from their parents if they needed it. And if you look at just people with low income but report that they can get money from their parents, their default rates aren't very high, or people that can't get money from their parents but have good income outcome. So I think, that's another, that's a whole layer to this problem that's a hard one to think about. In part because a lot of families are going to behave very differently in some of these environments. Some parents are going to provide that insurance, and even families that sort of may look the same may have different views on whether they're going to help their kid through college or provide them with income. I have to admit, I don't have the first. I have some ways I could model it, but I don't have the first idea how to think about it along with all of this stuff at the same time.
There's not much research that's being done right now.
Almost nothing. I mean, I think right now there's a focus of thinking about, I think the starting point is to think about an individual decision unit and how to set up and think about contracts in that environment. It's a little tricky. Once the kid grows up, in some sense, I mean, it's tricky to think about writing, I mean, it's really at a phase when kids go from being sort of decisions made by parents to when they're done with school, they're making all the, so it's kind of a weird phase to think about, if you were thinking about writing contracts with these guys, I think the government faces the same problem, and how do they want to determine financial aid for people? Do you expect parents to pay some amount? What if they don't? Do you just say, oh, your kid's screwed because you don't want to pay for it? And different countries, I think, have pretty different views on it. The Europeans and Latin Americans tend to say the government's going to provide it. We're not going to put parents on the hook for it. And the US, Canada, and a lot of others say, well, parents should be providing this kind of stuff. Yeah, I don't have a good answer. So I think we should have stopped like Steve said.
Let me just ask one more question. We had an email exchange about this, but that's about garnishing. All this work on incomplete contracts. I'm just thinking about this general equilibrium work and incomplete stuff like the UChicago. How would you said in the U.S. there is a potential for garnishing on student loans, but I think you also said it's fairly rarely used. Is that correct? I mean, the default. So I'm just wondering, in what way can you actually complete markets? I mean, there are all these ideas for years. Australia has this income contingent plan. Yale tried it unsuccessfully.
I mean, the U.S. now has some income-based repayments as well. They're very crude. It's like you pay a fraction of your income above some amount.
Tax system, I guess more specifically, would the tax system be a good way to kind of complete these markets and provide income? Everybody exposed to it.
No, that seems like the most natural way. That's what I think what the Australians have done. It's very odd that the U.S. has these two very separate. Now, the one thing they have is this income offset. If you have a tax return, they can seize that, the Department of Education. But otherwise, it's very separate from the income tax. So if you don't pay your loan back, that's one thing. It's different from not paying your taxes. They could throw you in jail for not paying your taxes, but they're not going to do it for not paying your loan. And how we want to think about, I can only imagine the people or the response to sort of locking up people who don't pay their student loans now. But it's not clear why we don't want to think about this as one, integrating it with the income tax system or the unemployment system or something. I think naturally one would want to think about this all at once, whether you can sort of get pretty close to it by thinking about it in parts, I don't know.
Like in Australia, you just look at the influence of family income on college.
I don't know what the numbers are.
Yeah, I just want to
Yeah, I don't know. Any Australians here?
I don't have that data.
You don't have that on your?
All right, I'm Reese.
I do know if you leave the country.